NAP Connection is a panel discussion on selected art issues with 3 guests and the host, James Carroll. Home viewers are invited to call and offer comments or questions during the live telecast. NAP Connection is brought to you by the New Arts Program, a nonprofit art service organization in cooperation with Berks Community Television. The New Arts Program is supported in part by the Pennsylvania Council on the Arts, local government, area businesses, NAP memberships, and individual contributions. Good evening. I'd like to welcome you. I'm James Carroll, and this evening we're going to talk with Janet Roberts, who is a poet-writer. And what we're going to be talking about is from her experiences, which have to do with Russia. She was over in Russia for 2 years, came back about, I think it was about 6 months ago. And she has an interview with a filmmaker who did a film over in Outer Mongolia, and this film is called URGA, U-R-G-A, Song, URGA Song. And what we're going to do is we're going to have some excerpts from that. The person who made this film is Jessica Hope Woodworth, and she is from the University of Stanford out in California, and she is in the video and film department. And what we're going to do is be seeing that short film, and also we are going to see some examples of their neighbor, which is Siberia. And I don't know how many of you are in knowledge of Mongolia. We usually think of Mongolia as being somewhere out there, out and away from China. We think of it as being somewhere hidden or removed from Siberia, but it's locked in between. They're quite contemporary. They have a democratic form of government, at least at this point in time. And when Janet gets here, she will be enlightening you more on it. Janet had the interview with Jessica Woodworth, and it was all prepared ahead of time. And so what we're going to do is now, and it's about four minutes and a few seconds long, this excerpt, URGA, U-R-G-A, URGA Song, by film excerpts by Jessica Hope Woodworth. And now we're going to see that. That was just a sort of synopsis or a few excerpts from her film. And as you can see, the artists in this case want dancer, choreographers. Their particular type of movement, or moving, as we refer to it in the avant-garde here in this country, has very little to do with a particular movement that we would find with the ballet aspect of it, in other words, of Russia. Here we have people that are doing interpretation. The sculpture seems to be a little more traditional, using the clay and building a process of what we refer to as a object-orientated form, a solid, or at least indications of what we see in the film. And as I mentioned, that they are somewhat democratic. It's also very cold, as we will see in the interview. We have had in the area of Kutztown and Fleetwood, Bill Hinton, who has been spending a number of years in northern China and also Mongolia. And so he would be a great reference in relation to Mongolia. I hope to have him sometime on the program. What I would like to do, as Janet is on her way, she got mislaid by traffic, I guess, and she should be coming in any minute. And what we would like to do now is to go to the interview. Now, the interview is about a little over 11 minutes. Now, since Janet isn't here, she knew the questions, or she has the questions that were asked. And Jessica, who is the filmmaker, is fulfilling the questions that are given to her. And the questions are very faint. So as we move into it, spread your ear and listen to the interview with Jessica Woodworth by Janet Robert.
Okay, I'm Jessica Woodworth, and I'm currently directing a 20-minute film about Mongolia.
Tell me more about it. What's it about?
It's entitled URGA Song, and it's essentially about the state of reform in Mongolia. In 1990, they went through a transition from a Soviet-dominated regime to a free market and democratic system. And so over this past decade, they've been suffering through the turmoil of the transition. And I was curious to look at the state of reform a decade following the transition. And I actually chose to look at the situation from the perspective of several young artists that live in Ulaanbaatar, in the capital of Mongolia.
Tell me more about why you chose Mongolia.
I chose to look at the Mongolian situation because I feel it's largely ignored, and where it's situated geographically is incredibly interesting. It's stuck between Russia and China, and with China's booming markets, there is an encroachment into the Mongolian markets, and with Russia's current catastrophe, all of Russian support and investment has been withdrawn. So they are in a very precarious situation economically and as well as politically. And I was very interested in Soviet history, and I thought that the Mongolian situation was fairly accessible for a young filmmaker like myself. And the people were very welcoming and very accommodating as well. And I had really no problems at all finding subjects, doing research in Mongolia, and it ended up being a very positive experience, albeit extremely far away and slightly cold, but no regrets at all.
What did you find was the general sentiment among the young people you met?
The young people in Mongolia, I was very interested in my peer group, actually, specifically because they were educated under a Soviet-dominated system. A lot of them were actually brought to Moscow to receive education at the high school level or higher. So people in their mid-20s and older, a lot of them have been educated in Russia, and all of them have been taught Russian, and so they have a very strong Russian cultural heritage, strong Russian influence in their upbringing, whereas the younger kids today don't. So what I wanted to do was look at the young and sort of my peer group in their 20s, those who had been educated under one system and have now entered the workforce since the transition, and are the ones who are being asked to set precedents in all realms in Ulaanbaatar, which is really the only sort of main city in Mongolia. And so they were taught one ideology, but now they're being forced to embrace another ideology of sorts, if you can term it that, and set precedents in every field. And I actually chose to look at several artists because I found the avant-garde there very interesting. A lot of them are very politically engaged, and a lot of them were very involved in the democracy movement, which sort of took hold in '89, but really took to the streets in '90, '91, and '92. And their work is very politically engaged, so I thought that that would be an interesting starting point to explore the general sentiment amongst the young today in Ulaanbaatar and how they feel about this economic crisis that they found themselves in and the political turmoil that they're being subjected to. To fill you in, the Democrats have not been able to unite into one cohesive force. So this sort of fractured parliament has been vulnerable to the misappropriation of aid money that's come in. There's been an enormous influx of aid. It's actually one of the highest recipients of aid per capita in the world. I mean, the population is very small, but it's a very interesting fact to keep in mind. But this enormous influx of aid has, of course, stimulated corruption. So the people in their mid to late 20s, they were among the initial reformers earlier this decade, and then those who hold political power now are considered fat cats, and no one really knows where money is disappearing to. Everyone's aware that there is aid, there is investment, but the government is not focused enough and competent enough to ensure that money is actually put in the right place. Education, for example, I mean, the educational system has entirely disintegrated. So it's a very difficult situation for the Mongolian people at the moment.
What were the challenges you found in filming in Mongolia?
The challenges I ran into filming, well, language. I don't speak Mongolian. I wish I did. But quite a few people speak English now, and I found an interpreter who was very competent and who I kept by my side the entire way through. I filmed in the summer months as well as the dead of winter, and that was tricky. That was quite tricky because it's really, really, really cold. It's about -40, -30, and I was there in December and January of this year. And the cameras freeze, so, you know, it's something you have to keep in mind. I mean, you can only be shooting exterior shots for very short periods of time. But like I said before, I mean, the people are extremely accommodating, and I really didn't have too many hurdles to cross, and no bureaucratic hurdles to cross. I didn't require permits to shoot in public spaces, and so, like you must do here, for example, in the United States.
And what effect do you hope the film will have?
Well, the effect I'd like the film to have on audiences, granted it reaches large numbers of people, I'm hoping that it will have a bit of a life on the festival circuit, maybe air on a few television stations. I would like to dispel this notion that the Mongolian people are these backward nomads. They're incredibly sophisticated people, and I can't emphasize that enough. Extremely educated, and one of my initial intentions was to dispel this stereotype of the sort of barbaric nomad that many Westerners have of Mongolians. And just to recognize a very interesting group of people at a very interesting point in their history. I mean, now they're, of course, heading towards a capitalist society, and their simultaneous transition has, brought up a lot of questions about which formulae may be appropriate for their particular environment. And a lot of people that I spoke with there don't believe that this extremely open democratic system is necessarily appropriate for them and their people at this point in time, and that hyper-capitalism is only doing damage to them, because their relationship to money is quite different from our own. They don't care as much as we do about acquiring things. That may change, it may be a naive perception of my own, but I believe that they are significantly different, and these economists and analysts and consultants who have parachuted in intermittently over the past 8-10 years have done significant damage as well as good, but I think that the Mongolians have to look at their situation as a very particular one and peculiar one. They have to take into account the fact that strategies that are used elsewhere are not necessarily appropriate for their people at this point in time.
That was the film excerpt that we saw from Jessica Woodworth. And as you could see, most of it was about the political aspect of the Mongolian. It's kind of interesting that their language, their universal language, was primarily Russian because they were basically trained. But now that in the 90s, since they've been involved with the democratic process, English is becoming more common, which is kind of interesting to have that kind of thing happen. Also, it's not a large country. It's small. And as I mentioned before, it's very cold there as far as winter. And it's Janet is here with us, and Janet, what is your relationship to Jessica? I mean, that you had her presenting her particular aspect, her film, and some excerpts in an interview. How do you know Jessica?
Well, Jessica is a young lady who's at Stanford University, who is receiving her degree, I think, on Saturday. She's getting a master's in film. And she came over and was interviewing the young people and the students and the young artists, a couple of whom you saw in the earlier clip, in the art school, which I, and along with 10 or 15 other foreign investors, rescued from bankruptcy. And Jessica was hanging out at the Green Horse Cafe, which was a revenue-building restaurant and gallery. Sounds familiar to the white dog, black cat scenario, right? At the University of Pennsylvania. May have taken some inspiration from that, but actually was the dream child of the Mongolian artists. They had a Joseph Beuys cafe. Joseph Beuys never visited Ulaanbaatar, but there is this myth that he did, so it's more real than if he had.
Kind of a spiritual. Totally.
Because of his presence, yes. And a lot of artists there have taken off on it. One of the remarkable discoveries in Mongolia and in Ulaanbaatar is discovering how lively contemporary art production is. It's absolutely startling. And why Jessica is defending the civilization and the level of sophistication of the Mongolians is that she was very much in touch with this young group of contemporary production artists and this group that created this art school. And I met her because she was hanging out there. And our manager of the cafe had noticed her because she's a beautiful young lady. She speaks beautiful French and Italian. Her father was in the Foreign Service, and she's lived all over the world. And as you can tell from the interview with her, she is a very serious young lady in terms of being sensitive to the political change and to the disruption and to the limitations and the constraints on the people there, which was a journey for her as well to discover, because she joined in their optimism and joined in their aspiration and wanted to create a film festival with Soros and made this film as her thesis for Stanford University. I was impressed by her. She impressed by her, her seriousness and her courage. She told me her professors, as being a professor myself at university, her professors at Stanford were very worried about her.
Meaning going over there?
Going out to Mongolia as a young woman by herself, and wanted her to communicate about it. And she was on planes and on horses, and every weekend there was some story from Jessica as I bumped into her on the run about where she had been. She went up in a plane with something like 12 generals of army generals of Mongolia. She did all sorts of things. But basically, her impressions are based a lot on the young people with whom I worked at the University of Colorado. And I've just come from being in Denver at the International Educators Conference and visited with the new dean, who really is sensitive to the difficulties that we had in setting up that site. I was the only faculty member from America there. The other one did not show up. And I had to set up the site and take care of it for that first semester. And it was quite a child to bring into the world. So Mongolia is developing, and it's very interesting to work there because there's so much work that needs to be done.
Well, it's a very dry area.
Oh,
climate-wise.
very dry. One of the joyous aspects of returning to Pennsylvania and to Philadelphia, though today's 28% humidity and 94 degrees Fahrenheit is not one of the best aspects, is the luxuriant vegetation and the trees and flowers that are blooming. I am just drinking in blossoms and color and moisture from trees and landscape. I can't seem to get enough.
I think she mentioned in there that the temperature, basically in the winter, it went down 20, 30, just like up in the tundra in Alaska.
Oh, and
it gets very cold.
Winter starts the 1st of October.
So it's
when I came home December 15th.
March or April, isn't it?
I had skied for 6 weeks. I had cross-country skied for 6 weeks. And there was more precipitation this year. If you read in any kind of almanac, Mongolia gets maybe between 4 and 8 inches the whole year.
Well, that's in this country, we would call it dry land, the prairie, which gets very little moisture.
But it's really desert.
But that's the maximum, and that's always.
Tibet has, it would appear, more luxuriant meadows and flowers blooming. Right now in Mongolia, it's a beautiful time to visit. If anyone wants to visit Mongolia, they should go.
In June, May?
End of June, July, August, except last year it rained all of August. So